Hey everyone, welcome to the Drow Historian. I'm Deke, and today we're going to do something a little different. So I just finished Servant of the Shard again. This is probably my fourth or fifth time through since it came out in 2000. And every time I come back to it, I remember why it's one of my favorites from the entire Legend of Drizzt. And this time, something stuck out to me that I thought would be a good topic of discussion. Crenshinibon, the Crystal Shard, actually outsmarts Jarlaxle. If you know anything about Jarlaxle, you know why that sentence is worth stopping on, because in the 40 books of this series, that almost never happens to him. He's not someone who gets outplayed, he's the one doing the outplaying. So let's talk about how that happens, why it's possible, and honestly why I think it's one of the most fascinating things Salvatore ever did with his character. If you're new to the Legend of Drizzt, first of all, welcome, and second of all, Jarlaxle is a drow mercenary who leads an organization called Brigand Earth. He operates in the shadows of Menzoberranzan, and he has thrived actually, in a society that murders people for sport by being smarter than everyone around him. And I don't mean smarter in a vague way, I mean he reads everyone. He is perpetually 3 steps ahead of every conversation he's in, and everyone around him knows it, and somehow that still doesn't stop them from being surprised when he outmaneuvers them. He keeps allies and enemies alike permanently off balance because no one ever quite knows what he wants or which side he's actually on. Jarlaxle is also an absolute expert with magical items. He's walking around with an enchanted eye patch, an extra-dimensional hat, bracers that produce an endless supply of throwing daggers, a displacement cloak, the list goes on. He doesn't just collect these things, he understands them. He knows what they do, how they work, how to use them, and crucially, he knows how to use them in combination with each other. If anyone in the realms was equipped by intelligence, by experience, or by sheer accumulated expertise to pick up a sentient artifact and not get burned by it, it should be Jarlaxle. And that's what makes this story so interesting, because in all of his long history, across all of his schemes and every enemy he's faced, this may be the only thing that ever truly outsmarts him. So let's talk about the Crystal Shard, what it actually is and how it works, because I think this context is essential to understanding why even Jarlaxle couldn't navigate it. Crenshinibon was created originally by 7 liches who poured their power into it to fashion an artifact of unimaginable strength. They made it draw power from sunlight, which for undead beings is their greatest enemy, as a kind of poetic insult to the living world they intended to conquer. The irony is that the liches were obliterated by the very energies they created. The sunlight properties of the artifact consumed them at the moment of its completion. But that's only half the story. Centuries later, a Zakaran sultan, a genuinely good man by all accounts, discovered the artifact and with his court wizards attempted a second creation. He wasn't interested in conquest, he wanted to protect his kingdom, so he used Crenshinibon's power to construct a line of crystalline towers stretching across the desert, a defensive network. But he overreached. The towers were spread too thin, and a sandstorm came, followed by an invasion. The towers shattered, and his family was murdered, and he could do nothing about it. And somewhere in that catastrophe, Crenshinibon absorbed a piece of the Sultan's spirit, his grief, his obsession, his desperate need to have held more power than he did. And that's what the Crystal Shard actually is. It's not just a powerful evil artifact. It's the echo of a trauma. It's the crystallized compulsion of a man who reached for too much and lost everything, looping endlessly, forever hungry for the level of power it once almost had. And that hunger, the singular, unthinking drive toward ever greater power, is how it operates as a sentient artifact. It doesn't reason like a person, it just manipulates. It finds what you want, and it becomes the path toward it. So we saw it at work with Akar Kessel, the hapless apprentice wizard from the very first Drizzt book, The Crystal Shard, who is essentially its puppet. Crenshinibon walks him from mediocrity to attempted regional conquest, and Kessel barely understands what's happening to him. He thinks he's becoming powerful. He's actually just becoming useful to Crenshinibon. And then there's Heir 2, a Balor of the Abyss, a creature of immense power and ancient will who spends centuries craving Crenshinibon. The shard has so thoroughly planted the image of what it could offer Heir 2 that even a demon lord can't let it go, and that's the scope of the shard's power. So at this point in the story of Servant of the Shard, Jarlaxle has already tricked Drizzt into delivering Crenshinibon directly to him and is now bringing Drow into Kalimport to attempt a takeover of the most powerful guild houses in the region, and he thinks he's the one with enough self-awareness to use it without being used himself. So I want to walk through some of the actual moments from the book to see what we can find out about how Crenshinibon undermines Jarlaxle. The first thing Crenshinibon does is choose Jarlaxle. Salvatore actually gives us a chapter passage from the artifact's perspective, which is a remarkable narrative move where it seizes him up as a wielder. And what it concludes is the only other person who has ever shut out its call as completely as Jarlaxle does is Drizzt. But Drizzt's resistance is built on morality. There's a permanent wall of conscience that the shard can never breach with Drizzt. Jarlaxle's resistance is totally different. He's not resisting because he thinks the shard is evil. He's resisting because he treats everything as a tool to be used by him. And the artifact recognizes that this means there's no permanent barrier stopping it. Jarlaxle is constantly shifting his self-interest, and so that's a road that Crenshinibon can try to steer. Crenshinibon explicitly decides not to seek a different wielder. Jarlaxle is too interesting and too full of potential. And you can actually see the early effects of that almost immediately. There's a scene early in the book where Jarlaxle and Entreri are sparring, which, by the way, already has Rhaegai baffled. He can't understand why Jarlaxle would spar with anyone, let alone the human Entreri. Jarlaxle has survived by being unknowable. No one ever gets a clear read on him, and here he is voluntarily letting one of the most dangerous assassins in the world get close enough to study how he moves and what he carries. And that's not something the old Jarlaxle really does. But the more telling moment comes during the sparring session when Jarlaxle pulls open his cloak and shows Entreri the Crystal Shard, and it's tucked into his pocket, and he says something like, "Joined with Crenshinibon, I can destroy you with a thought. Never forget that." And Entreri notices something he almost never sees on Jarlaxle's face: genuine rage. Not the sly, amused control that Jarlaxle always presents. This is something real and unguarded and slightly off from what Entreri expects. So a lot of things start to take shape in the book, and they are planning an assault on Dalabad Oasis. And Jarlaxle is working through intelligence reports, and he feels the shard reaching in, and he dismisses it, and he moves his magical eye patch, which blocks its telepathy, and he tries to work through the problem on his own, but the call gets stronger, strong enough that he actually removes the eye patch voluntarily to have a more direct conversation. And Crenshinibon gives him genuinely useful information. It correctly reads Entreri's hidden agenda. Entreri's trying to get Cairn's Claw, and he kind of has to manipulate Jarlaxle and the Drow into taking Dalabad Oasis so he can get in there. So Crenshinibon analyzes the situation very accurately, and by the end of this conversation, both Jarlaxle and the artifact have arrived at the same conclusion about Dalabad, and Jarlaxle actually laughs, delighted that he and his newest acquisition are of one mind. This is a very subtle move. The shard's not lying to him, it actually helps him. It's earning his trust by being a good partner. And in doing so, it also steers the whole operation towards its own goal, a crystalline tower, a physical image of itself collecting sunlight, which is, of course, what Crenshinibon always wants. So Jarlaxle gets the tactical advantage, and the shard is going to get its tower. And Jarlaxle walks away thinking that the arrangement is working well for him. But the arrangement is definitely not really working for him. He's missing that his lieutenants, Rhaegai and Camuriel, are uneasy with the expansion onto the surface already, and they're starting to see that Jarlaxle is being reckless. This is not something he would normally do, but more revealing is that he's losing his uncanny awareness of how his own crew are perceiving him. This is a very Jarlaxle thing. He's constantly aware of what everyone's motivations are around him. So then there's this moment during the actual battle for Dalabad where Jarlaxle, sitting comfortably inside the newly constructed crystalline tower, says casually that they should have attacked at night. And Crenshinibon comes back immediately saying, "Daytime is when my power is at its peak." And Salvatore tells us that Jarlaxle felt the rest of the thought keenly. The shard was not so subtly reminding him that it was more powerful than all of Bregan de Aerith combined. Jarlaxle registers it as more than a little disconcerting for reasons he hadn't begun to untangle. This is also weird. Jarlaxle, who untangles everything very quickly, can't quite name what's bothering him about this. And the battle is happening at the shard's preferred time of day, and it's going perfectly. Again, Jarlaxle thinks he is aware, but in reality is missing some crucially important nuance. The escalation eventually leads to the plan that finally tips his lieutenants towards mutiny. He wants to construct a visible crystalline tower in the middle of Kalimport. Rhaegai and Camuriel are alarmed. Entreri, who knows the city better than anyone, says it will draw the Wizards Guild against them. It's suicidal. Everyone in the room can see it except Jarlaxle, the man who has spent his entire career surviving on invisibility, on secrecy, on the power of being the one no one can quite locate or predict, and here he is proposing to build a landmark that announces exactly who he is and what he does. And after the conquest of Dalabad, he stands before his lieutenants and says, "Crenshinibon belongs to me." And Entreri watches Rhaegai's face and wonders privately if the mercenary leader isn't a bit confused about who owns whom. Eventually, Entreri steals the shard, and in the aftermath, he walks Jarlaxle through exactly what has been happening. He points out that Jarlaxle went to destroy the crystalline tower at Dalabad at one point, but then didn't. Why not? And Jarlaxle says, "I saw no reason to drop the tower as soon as I knew that I could." And he hears himself say it, and he stops. And Salvatore writes, he had been duped. He, the master of intrigue, had been fooled into believing that he was in control. And that's the whole thing right there. The shard controlled his sense of his own agency. It made him feel like keeping the tower was his decision. The feeling of mastery was the trap. And then near the end, when they're on their way to the dragon Hephaestus to destroy the shard, Jarlaxle suddenly suggests maybe they're being premature. Maybe just knowing they can destroy it is enough leverage to control it. Entreri plays along for a minute and then points the logic out yet again. Because if you know you can destroy the crystalline tower, then there's no possible way you will wind up with two crystalline towers. And the grin disappears from Jarlaxle's face and says, "It did it again." "Same bait on the hook and the Jarlaxle fish chomps even harder," is Entreri's reply. The shard is being carried by Entreri in his pouch at this point, and it still got to Jarlaxle. It has spent enough time with him that it understands exactly how his mind works, and all it has to do is send out a small suggestion, and Jarlaxle's own intelligence assembles the rest. So Crenshinibon's wielders actually out-argue themselves into the shard's position. One other thing to point out is there's a little bit of a subplot in the book where the shard is also sensing that Jarlaxle may not be the right wielder as time moves on, and it begins to influence Rhaegai. And Rhaegai is now being drawn in as well, and he wants the Crystal Shard for himself, which is kind of leads to a final confrontation. So one other thing I wanted to point out in this video is why it is that both Drizzt and Entreri can carry the shard and not be influenced by it. So Drizzt carries it briefly and it can't do anything to him. His morality, as we mentioned earlier, creates a wall and the artifact just has nothing to offer Drizzt. Entreri carries it and shuts it down through pure force of will. His famous emotional emptiness, the thing that has haunted him across his whole arc in the series, turns out to be an unlikely armor. the shard just finds nothing that it can grip onto within Intrere. So Jarlaxle sits between these two. He's smarter than most people who've ever held it. He understands the magic and the manipulation, and he understands that there's a little game being played with it, but that is exactly his vulnerability, because he wants things. Power, expansion, control of his own future, and the shard is very good at becoming the path toward what you want. The book is essentially arguing that of the three ways to resist Crenshinibon, morality, emptiness, or intelligence, intelligence is the most dangerous one, because intelligence can be used against you by something that understands how you think. So that's Jarlaxle's folly as I've been thinking about it. One of the sharpest minds in the realms, a man who has survived everything Menzoberranzan and the surface world could throw at him, steered by a magical artifact. Jarlaxle is almost always the one doing the manipulating, so it's really cool in this book to get a peek behind the curtain and see that even he has a weakness. I hope you've enjoyed this exploration. Let me know in the comments, and maybe I'll do more videos like this one covering various aspects of the books. If you want to spend more time with me and this book specifically, I've just released a full episode of the Drizzt Chronicle covering the entirety of Servant of the Shard over on Patreon and for channel members. Your support helps greatly to keep this channel alive. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week for more lore from the Forgotten Realms and the Legend of Drizzt.